Hello, my name is Rachel Smith.
And my name is Faith Jones.
And in this podcast, Trash Can Panda, new media presentation, we'll be discussing fanfiction's impact on canon. We'll prove through a few specific examples, to name Star Trek, Star Wars, and Doctor Who, that fanfiction does in fact have an impact on canon and takes the canon in a direction that would have never possibly been, and actually has benefits and impacts on real people's lives, and a lot of other really cool things.
So we'll just take you on this audio journey of fan fiction. Starting off with, what are some definitions of what fan fiction is? You can go to Tumblr, you can go to, Reddit, and find personal kind of definitions of what fan fiction is. But starting off, we will be using a quote from Angela Thomas from her work, Fan Fiction Online, Engagement, Critical Response, and Effective Playthrough Writing. She says that fanfiction, it borrows settings, plots, characters, and ideas from all forms of media and popular culture. Fans weave together new tales, sometimes within the accepted canon, the real works from which they are borrowing, sometimes blending several ideas from different sources, for example, Star Wars meets Middle-earth, together in a type of fiction called crossovers, and sometimes imagining new possibilities for additional characters, different histories, or different settings to build on existing stories called alternate universe fiction. And so, that's a really long way of saying that we will take, and I say we because I feel like all of us we kind of participate in this fan fiction, but just,
For
sure. Taking, Star Wars, Rachel and I are here sitting with our Star Wars and Doctor Who fan t-shirts on, and I would say we both have, actively participated in this fan culture. What do you have something to add with that?
I think what we'll primarily be focusing on is the alternative universe fiction and how alternative universe created the canon, created a new canon, especially with what we'll talk about in Doctor Who and Star Wars. Star Wars had its own alternative universe called the Expanded Universe, which now it does play a part in the new movies, does play a part in 7 through 9. And I know Faith will talk about Doctor Who and its impact on the canon.
Exactly. So, where does this all kind of start as far as fan fiction? A lot of people and critics will point to Star Trek as that basis. And so, starting with Star Trek, there's this thing called fanzines. Fanzines are essentially, if you can put two and two together, a fan magazine. And Henry Jenkins actually had a really great talk with, I am losing her name right now. Hang on just a second. With Joan Marie Verba. It's posted on his blog entitled Star Trek Darkover, Thunderbirds and Fanfiction, an interview with Joan Marie Verba, Part 1. And essentially in this interview, Verba, she kind of discusses her own experiences with fanzines, and so with her commenting on how Star Trek was kind of like the first to impact fans' impact on canon, she says that though by the time Star Trek came along, very few science fiction magazines published fiction, since there was a sufficient professional science fiction magazines for short story writers to submit to. But for Star Trek fiction writers, there was little or no opportunity for publication except for fanzines for the large supply and demand for stories. Once Star Trek fanzines had been established, readers with no knowledge of science fiction fanzines read Star Trek fanzines and got the idea to publish their own Star Trek fanzines as well. So it's a lot of fanzines, but, even for her, she was able to start participating within the fan culture of, extending Star Trek's universe. And I think it shows up a lot, whenever she also speaks later in this interview about how Star Trek, its direct impact on canon with Star Trek, The Next Generation. And now with, a new movie coming out this summer with, I even forgot what it's called, Star Trek The Journey or something along those lines.
Star Trek into more trekking, into darkness.
Basically, Star Trek, and let's do as much as we possibly can in the Star Trek universe as possible. So definitely making a profit on the fans. Essentially, that's what it's coming down to. They understand it's a cash cow that, we will throw money at them.
And it is interesting because I know she talks about in that article how a lot of the fanzines sort of focused on plot lines and story arcs that they didn't really discuss. I know a lot that came out of it was that ship, or the slash between Spock and Kirk, but how that sort of opened a door for LGBT writers and LGBT narratives in a time where there was not any of those kind of narratives. Yeah. And especially extending the universes of the women in Star Trek. I know that played a large role in it.
Nice. Yeah, and then, and it shows up in Doctor Who as well. Just, I think, this past year or two, they finally introduced, they're not main characters, they're secondary characters, but they actually have a gay relationship with each other. It's Madame Vastra, and people think that her servant Jenny, but they later revealed this past season or two that they're actually a married couple. And it's not only is it LGBTQ+, but it's also cross-racial, because she's a Slovene, which is a lizard person, and she's a human. So breaking barriers with all the good fictional stuff. So,
and I think a lot of this too, like with the fan fiction writing, with how much slash fiction there is, with that sort of new market, it has to be impacting the canon. It is impacting the canon, proving that this is the sort of thing they need to be putting into it. It doesn't all have to be these white worlds and these heterosexual couples, because they're realizing now that their fan base has become so large that they can write these sort of plot lines, because that is the market out there. The reason that these sort of slash fictions, I think, are becoming such a big deal is something similar to what I read in a Jenkins article referencing Black's 2004, that fanfiction being an element of popular culture that is growing in popularity as new technologies enable native and non-native speaking fans from all over the globe to meet online to share, critique, and build upon each other's fictions. I think relating back to the canon, because when so many writers from so many different cultures are putting their culture into the fiction, that it's impacting the canon. It's changing the way people start talking about things, and people, like, when you have that sort of thing, when you have so much slash fiction, because their audience now includes LGBT people instead of just the straight white writers, then they realize they have to change it to match their fans.
Yeah, that's literally so true. And I know we keep talking about Henry Jenkins, but he's done a lot of really great work in kind of the study of fan fiction. I don't believe that when people go to college, they kind of go in I'm gonna write my doctoral dissertation on fan culture. So it's kind of more in the blog universe. But another really great quote Jenkins has from his Convergence culture. He says that fans are, referencing to Diane Nelson, who's the senior vice president of Warner Brothers, said that fans are core shareholders of a particular property, the lifeblood of a franchise. Because literally without the fans, this would not happen. They understand, they see the market, they see the amount of, I guess you could say, property that fans are writing, and literally taking their stories and running with it. And so they understand that there's an interest, so of course they're going to make money off of it. I mean, I've already spent so much money on Harry Potter, it's fine.
But it even goes back to Bolter talking about hypertext, and how sort of fan fiction is its own hypertext, because it's blurring that line between reader and writer. Because they are core shareholders. You're not making this series for yourself. You're not publishing, or you're not creating these episodes of Star Wars to show in your own bedroom. You're creating them for fans. And so if they don't match the fans' demographics, and they don't match what the fans want, it changes. That's why, even though some people on the internet are making a stink about it, that's why lead characters in Star Wars are women. That's why there's a black stormtrooper. Because they realize it has to match their demographic.
Right, that's so true. And I know that maybe we can move into our, the personal kind of experiences that we both have. You could call us the resident experts of Rachel for Star Wars and me for Doctor Who. So maybe, Rachel, if you kind of go and talk about some examples of this in Star Wars.
Well, Star Wars is a huge example. Star Wars, the discussion of the expanded universe is essentially a discussion in fan fiction, including a very interesting Facebook group called Disney Star Wars Movies Are Fan Fiction. Long live the expanded universe. How there's article after article discussing how characters in Star Wars, the 7th movie that just came out, are essentially taken from the extended universe. And the EU, which we'll call for short, just a reminder, is entirely fan fiction. It is fan written. It is not written in compilation with Lucas's permission. It was completely and entirely fan written. And it's so interesting because even Lucasfilms themselves, with the Disney company, have admitted and have openly talked about how they're going to use the EU. They're not going to take necessarily the exact stories from it. But there was one quote that said, while Lucasfilms always strive to keep the stories created for the EU universe consistent with our film and television content as well as internally consistent, Lucas always made it clear that he was not beholden to the EU. So he didn't necessarily have to do what the fans did. In order to give maximum creative freedom to the filmmakers and also preserve an element of surprise and discovery for the audience, Star Wars Episodes 7 through 9 will not tell the same story told in the post-Return of the Jedi expanded universe. However, some examples of the EU are included, and they go on to say Luke's wife will be, whenever she's presented, will be the one from the EU. Red hair, green eyes, her attitude, etc. The same, this is such a big one, the same with the kids of the big three, including Jania will be the inspiration for the Solo daughter, Jason for the Solo son, and Ben for the Skywalker son, which sort of leads into a larger discussion on who Jason Solo ends up being. Jason Solo being the child of Leia and Han, who in the movie is named Kylo Ren. And if you see the movie, you'll know who this is. And especially at the end when that's his name he chooses for himself. The name he's actually born with is Ben, which is interesting because they say here Ben for the Skywalker son. Ben was an entirely different character who has a different outcome. Jason has the similar outcome to Kylo Ren. He is born from Han and Leia. He chooses the dark side and is eventually killed by his sister, Janya, which will be interesting when they'll see how that comes into action. Is Janya going to be Rey? Are they going to be related? Does that make the entire shipping culture of theirs very weird indeed? But it's just so interesting to think that these universe created this movie, that they took the idea for these people from fanfiction. Kylo Ren is a replica of something from fanfiction, and even, as we showed in a presentation, a 2008 comic pictured Jason, because obviously he was never cast in a movie, pictured him in a way that looks very, very similar to Adam Driver. So the argument can honestly be made that this idea that this creation of a fanfiction led to the casting of Adam Driver. And so, like, the changing of the canon has such a big impact, not just on a story arc that we all watch, not just on these movies that we pay hundreds and millions of dollars for, but on someone's life. Adam Driver is a good actor, was in other things before Star Wars, but Star Wars is easily going to be one of the biggest cash cows in his life. And someone's comic might have done that for him, and that's just crazy to think about. Yeah. And you can even say that too, I know we discussed earlier in our presentation, the whole Jar Jar Binks is a Sith Lord, which he is. He is a Sith Lord conversation. But you could say that the fans' such volatile reaction to him being a Sith Lord and him no longer being a Sith Lord and ended up being a character that sort of appears in the first movie and peters out might have ruined the career for the person who voiced him. Because Frank Oz voiced Yoda, who everyone loved, and then Frank Oz went on to have a career that was real. However, Ahmed Best, who voiced Jar Jar Binks, have you heard of him? I haven't heard of him. He hasn't done anything. He voiced Jar Jar Binks, and people hate him. The fans changed the canon, might have ruined his life, because if he'd ever had the chance to come out and be Jar Jar Binks, the kick-A Sith Lord, he could have gone on to be just as successful as Frank Oz. But the fans took that from him. Because the fans also gave it back to Adam Driver. I know, so it's a beautiful cycle.
It's a beautiful, like, vicious cycle of how fans actually do have a huge impact on culture. So, like, that's with Star Wars. And so with Doctor Who, it's just as complicated. It's just as much of a cluster as it is the Star Wars universe, because, you know, you have 50 years of canon to parse through. And I'm not going to sit here and attempt to explain 50 years of canon, but it's basically the story of a man who is from Gallifrey, who is a Time Lord. That's his race. He steals a time machine, and based on circumstances, the cloaking device messed up, so it's forever a blue police box, and he travels through space and time, primarily with a companion, and, you know, just get into a lot of trouble and change the history. They change time. I mean, you name it, they'll change it. So it's very difficult to explain. So there's 13 doctors, We're currently on our 13th Doctor, or 12th if you want to really argue with me, but 13. But the biggest thing about how, you know, Doctor Who is related to kind of this big conversation on fan culture is that with having been on the air for 50 years, you know, the show has seen so many generations of not only viewers but writers and directors. And in the UK, they have, you know, here in America we have writers, but honestly, like, could you name the writer of Scandal, or could you name the writer for House of Cards? Like,
Nope.
Exactly. So like these big hit TV shows, no one knows who writes them. But in the UK, they're a little bit more known. So like for instance, Downton Abbey. That's its showrunner. His name is Julian Fellows. For Doctor Who, when the reboot happened in the early 2000s, his name is Russell T Davies. And the current showrunner, who is about to leave Doctor Who, his name is Stephen Moffat. So their names are a bit more prominent, but the really cool thing, though, about this kind of the new resurgence of Doctor Who is that these showrunners, they were fans of the show when they were younger. And, you know, even before getting into the writers, even the doctors were fans of the show, which I remember when Peter Capaldi, who is the current Doctor, when he was announced that he was going to play the role, there was a little news clipping that was kind of like came up from under the rug of when Peter Capaldi, when he was like 7 or 10 years old, actually wrote to this newspaper about how he loved like last week's episode of Doctor Who, or how he wanted to be Doctor Who. And so like literally there's so many generations that play into this. So, you know, Stephen Moffat, like I said, is the current showrunner. A lot of people have asked him, you know, what is his views on fan fiction, and you know, he has like some interesting thoughts behind it of what fan fiction is. He prefers it to be called fiction in general.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, he says that, you know, is fan fiction like a worthwhile pastime for friends? And he actually said in an interview during Sherlock, the official Sherlock convention, which I would love to go, he said, "I take it very seriously and I get very cross when people say I've mocked it. I would never do that as of anyone who has ever lived. I am the man who writes fan fiction for a living." And I think that I think that speaks volumes as to how, you know, Stephen Moffat, who actually has had a major hand in changing the canon of Doctor Who for the past 50 years, he has now not only entered in another Doctor who, like I said earlier, was kind of controversial of whether or not you consider the current Doctor the 12th or 13th. He's also changed a major plot line of now the Doctor can find Gallifrey, which it was, before Stephen Moffat wrote it, Gallifrey was lost forever because it was destroyed in the Great Time War by the Daleks. And now that's a thing that can like happen, and a lot of people are not okay with it, but some people are really okay. So, you know, even as like a showrunner, like writers, the writers are fans, which I think is incredible. Like to actually get to write fan fiction for a living, I would love to get paid to write fan fiction for a living, but it's to show, you know, with this example of Doctor Who, how, you know, it really, really impacts the show, and I think it brings it out even more that a fan wrote it, and that, you know, it's sticking out in people's minds more because it's not some like executive person that's asking them to like pump out something. It's written from the heart, even though Stephen Moffat frequently rips people's hearts out with his stories, but that's okay.
So what is the point? Why does it matter if fan fiction can impact the canon? And it sort of is broken down into a few things, the most important of which is empowerment. When we talk about the article Heather Can Write and everything Heather did, going up against Warner Brothers and winning, like, we talk about that. She talks about in her own article, they underestimated how interconnected our fandom was. They underestimated the fact that we knew those kids in Poland and we knew the rinky-dink sites and we cared about them. Fanfiction leads to empowerment because it allows you in the driver's seat. It allows you to create characters who match your culture. It's incredible. You can have these characters who are Muslim, who are gay black men, like all these things that you couldn't even think of that you might fall into as an individual that would never be on mainstream television, they become the main character. And you feel like when they're the main character, that they matter. And because they matter, you matter.
Another really great aspect about this is there's an educational aspect about it. And Laura, in her presentation, she mentioned that World of Warcraft is used as a really big learning tool. As far as fan fiction goes, from Why Heather Can Write, also by Henry Jenkins. Our man Jenkins. He says that not everything kids learn from pop culture is bad for them. Some of the best writing instruction takes place outside the classroom. So I just think, like, you know, there's a huge communal aspect that can be taken from writing, whether you want it critiqued, where you just want to share, like, your love, and there's a large, like, fan response.
And even from a marketing standpoint, you get fans involved in your show. You get fans feel like they have a part of what happens. They have a part of the plot that they love so much. All these EU writers, I'm sure, are ecstatic that they impacted these movies, that the characters that they created through fan fiction are on the big screen, are Kylo Ren, could possibly be Rey. And it's really awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so, like, if you're watching this, or, well, you're definitely not watching this, if you're hearing us and you kind of came into this skeptical about how fan fiction, and like, yeah, it must be like a Tumblr thing. Like, no, it really does have a direct impact on your viewing experience. It has a huge marketing aspect to it. It just has, like, a large cultural piece. And so this is why, like, we really wanted to pursue studying fan fiction more at a serious level, despite all of our great fan theories. And Jar Jar Binks is a Sith Lord.
He is a Sith Lord.
He is a Sith Lord. Well, thank you for listening to New Media Trash Can Banner, our great final project of why fan fiction has an impact on canon.
And why it's important to you and me. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.